So the idea now is to talk about the theories of change relative to media support and perhaps the need of benchmarks. So to start with, we thought it might be useful to remind ourselves that any process of individual change go through a first cognitive step. I might learn about an issue, I might gain information on this issue, might understand it or not understand it, and then there is a second step that is affective. I might like or dislike the options I see, and this might lead to a third step that is an action and a change in behavior. I highlight this process because the research on media effect shows that media effect at this level, at behavior change, is rather difficult. It's difficult to isolate the media factor in behavior change because behavior change is the result of so many social variables, right? However, the media effect on the two first steps, the cognitive change and the affective change, is pretty well established, and we'll quote a few studies on that. Also, the other points we wanted to make is that there are different types of media content that are more effective according to whether you want to affect a cognitive change or an affective change.
Thanks. So, indeed, different media approaches. The cognitive approach on your right, it relates to the rational part of yourself. It is efficient, according to studies, because it's built on fact, on trust in produced by a rational process, and on to some extent on the proximity of what you are told or what you see and what you live in your real life, the direct connection. The change through affective approach on your left, as it says, it builds on the affect, on emotions. It is also efficient. There are studies showing that you can, based on fiction, on soap opera, on created reality, have an effect. These two approaches are not mutually exclusive, and it's not that one is right and one is wrong. Our message today is that you have to be aware of the approach you want to use, or that your partner or your implementing operator is using. Because it's important to be coherent between your theory of change and the approach you're going to be using and your end of the chain objectives.
Another distinction that is perhaps more tricky but also very important is the distinction between so-called objective media and more suggestive media approaches. When we talk about objective media, of course we don't claim that a media can fully exclude any subjectivity or that there is such a thing as pure objectivity. This, of course, doesn't exist. Objectivity is an ideal. You can aim for it, but you never reach it fully. When we use the term objective media, it's a kind of a short term to refer to the set of rules that characterized professional media, and that includes reporting facts and remorse and not remorse, to cross-check information, to be as inclusive and balanced as you can, in making sure that you have the different points of views, that you have representative of the different stakeholders, that you give them equal speaking time, all those rules that characterize professional media. That's what we refer to when we talk about objective media. At Fondation Hirondelle, we believe that actually sticking to those professional rules of professional journalism is the best way to ensure that the media is credible, gain the trust of its audience, and therefore, at the end of the day, is effective. And now, just would like to quote a recent study that is very interesting on this tension between objective versus suggestive media approach. That's a study that was done by a researcher from Nigeria called Convincing Rebel Fighters to Disarm. It was done in DRC. This researcher took the example of Radio Capi, this radio that is the radio of the UN peacekeeping mission in DRC. And he compared between 2008 and 2010 two different programs. This first program called Gutahuka, which basically means in Kiswahili, back home, go back home. It was targeting FDLR, so Hutu rebels from Rwanda that left the country, fled and hid in the forest in DRC, and are still a very destabilizing force in the region. And so they targeted the FDLR, and with this message, go back to Rwanda, give up the weapons and go back to Rwanda. So a very, very suggestive media approach. It's even, you can even call it a psyops, so a psychological operation. And he compared the listeners of this program to listeners of Dialogue entre Congolais, that a program, as the title show, is a program of dialogue. According to this researcher, he calls it informative approach. So the idea is really to have different stakeholders, different points of view, discussing on a fair basis daily life issues, social, economical, political issues. And the result of the study are the following. He found out that Gutahuka listeners had a much more emotional and in a rather narrow understanding of the root causes of the conflict. And their reasoning reflected actually the basic message of the program. Their understanding was that if Wagners leave the country, if the Hutu Rwandan leave the DRC, there will be peace. They were showing less empathy towards the antagonist group too, compared to Dialogue entre Congolais listeners, who were much richer in the way they were understanding the root causes of the conflict. He showed that the impact, the effect of this media program was not so much on the result of the reasoning, but on the way the people think. They were taking into account different, points of view. They had a more rational, more logical analysis of the issues. And they were having a greater sense of ownership in the democratic process also. They had a greater collective sense of responsibility. A criticism, though, he highlighted that Dialogue entre Congolais debates perhaps too much the problems and not enough the solution. So the people didn't really, they were agreeing on what are the root causes and the main problems, but they couldn't really find, okay, what are the solutions to those problems? So that's something we need also to work on. So a pretty powerful evidence of the potential impact of those informative, objective media approach. But there are also studies really showing exactly the contrary. That a more suggestive approach had a better impact on compared to a more factual approach. So I think what we really lack at this stage, because we are still at the early days in terms of research on this. Actually, there were a lot of study on the effect of media in fostering conflict and tensions, but not so much about fostering peace and how you come to this result. So we're still at the early stage, and what we lack is also more longitudinal, long-term studies to understand the long-term effect of those different type of programs. So perhaps now Caroline can tell you a little bit more about our own theory of change and how we assess it.
Thanks. 2 words on a little bit of background. The media sector is still quite new as a sector in international development. And as a sector, it doesn't have an overall theory of change yet. It is something that the various operators recognize. We are starting to collectively think about a theory of change, but it goes back to the actors that have a cognitive approach versus the one that have an affective approach. So we're still debating how to reconcile, if we have to reconcile, and what theory could be developed so that the donors integrate that theory of change in their strategy. In Fondation Hirondelle, as I said, we were created by journalists, pure journalists, not people coming from international development sector. And for them, it was only one approach, the cognitive approach, facts, sources, dialogue. And for many, many years within our organization, we didn't have a theory of change. I can say it was taboo, because for journalists, their role is to inform. What happens after that, it's not their problems. It's not their. They didn't feel that they had the right to change people's life. Their mission was to inform people. But the world is changing. And in the last couple of years, we realized that, yes, information and to inform people is important, but there is a change. De facto, there is a change. So as Fondation Hirondelle, what change do we want? What change are we being capable of taking the responsibility for? So since 2017, it's very recent, we agreed to put that change into words. And the change we want to promote or contribute to is more understanding, more dialogue, and more peaceful resolution of violent conflicts. This is the key words in the sentence. And from that theory of change, we have our three set of activities I mentioned this afternoon, the production, the support, the research. There are outcomes where we have both indicators, qualitative and qualitative indicators and means of verification, working with academic and professionals to measure effects on outcomes. A series of assumptions that we still need to work on, and there we really need, as a sector, to be more, I would say, smart on these assumptions, but also with the other actors in the peacekeeping, in the governance, in the conflict resolution sectors, to complement these assumptions. And I think there the donors have a big role to play, because they are the one with the global views. What assumptions are we missing? On the impact, we are almost at zero. As Sasha said, there is not yet a long-term study that from the baseline to 20 years down the road has looked as the work, the effect, and the reality of the media and what it has changed, thinking impact as a long-term and non-revocable change. So our weakness and where we need to work as a sector and with the donors is on qualitative indicator at the impact level and more long-term studies.
So we organized a meeting of different media development actors in Geneva last year to share experiences on theory of change and how do we assess it. We came to this agreement that it would be useful to have a sector-level theory of change, that we could share indicators, share assumption, and share also studies and resources to do study to better understand the sector-level impact and long-term impact. Another thing we discussed was this distinction between indicators to assess impact on one side, that's one thing, and also acknowledging that there is a level of impact we will never be able to trace back to the media, right? Like it will be always very difficult to isolate the media factor in impacting a very high level impact. So acknowledging this fact, we thought what would be also useful, a part of indicators to assess impact, would be to have benchmarks that won't help you to assess your impact, but that will guide your operations. And a little bit being inspired of what the humanitarian sector has done regarding the core humanitarian standards. There are no such benchmarks for media development sector, and that's something we think would be very useful and we will be eager to work on. So that's perhaps again an opportunity for collaboration with the network, is to work on this sector level theory of change and assumptions with regard to governance issues. That's one thing. And the other one is to work on those benchmarks, so the guiding principles of good media development.